This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1058, a conversation with back issues Roger Ash.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1058. It's a conversation with Roger Ash. If you don't know Roger, you soon will. He's the new editor-in-chief of Back Issue magazine, which is published by Tomorrow's Publishing. It's a fantastic magazine which has been published for the last, 150 so episodes. Has had 150-something issues. It's been running for 20 years, and it was previously edited by Michael Eury. And Michael Eury was recently on this very podcast. He was always a fun guest. He was only on twice, unfortunately. I wasn't able to have him on more. He was on episode 982 back in June 2022, and he was on episode 1030 earlier this year back in March 2024. Well, as of September 1st, Michael Eury is no longer the editor of Back Issue magazine. Now we have Roger Ash in the big seat, the hot seat. And today he comes on the Comic Shenanigans podcast to talk about taking over the magazine, what he has planned for it, also his kind of history with reading comics, getting into comics, writing about comics, his association with Tomorrow's Publishing. So this was a really fun conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy it. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. We have great episodes coming up. We have another episode coming up with Brian Cunningham soon, which I'm really excited about. We're hopefully going to have Ron Friends back on the show soon. So good stuff. So you have to, keep your eyes peeled on your podcast feed and make sure you download those episodes. Thank you for downloading this episode as we talk with Roger Ash. If you are new to the show because you saw this link in the Back Issue magazine Facebook group, you should check out the catalog. There's a lot of people we've talked to in the past, including, as I said, Michael Eury. We've also interviewed John Morrow, obviously from Tomorrow's Publishing. We've also had a lot of other great creator interviews that I really do welcome you to check out the back catalog because there's a lot of fun stuff there. Anyways, without further ado, let's jump right into the episode with Roger Ash. Enjoy. Roger, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know, you are the new editor of Back Issue magazine, which is one of the great magazines published by Tomorrow's Publishing. But I guess we should go way back first and, establish your comic book bona fides. When did you first become a fan of comic books?
Oh, boy. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember the first two comics that I bought that got me into collecting, and it would have been in the late 70s. And those were Howard the Duck, number 25, and Laugh Olympics, number 4, back when Marvel had the Hanna-Barbera license.
Oh, very cool. What do you think it was about those that really kind of, planted the bug?
Well, as a kid, I remember getting stuff for, road trips. We had a lot of Disney digests around the house that would keep us occupied when we were in the car and stuff like that. And so even though I had a few friends who collected comics, I think the fact that those were more cartoony, one of them starring a duck, the other one based on a Saturday morning cartoon that I enjoyed, I just sort of gravitated towards them, and I enjoyed both of them, both very different comics, obviously, but I liked both of them quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And just decided I wanted to see what I could find after that, and just kept going. And like I said, I had a friend or two who collected as well, so they were also encouraging.
Mm-hmm. I'm always curious about, because Howard the Duck's such an interesting character and series, so I'm always curious, how that played for kids at the time. Obviously it was it was, playing up in terms of its age. So I'm always curious on how it would have impacted someone who was much younger like yourself.
I obviously did not get all of what was going on in the book when I first read it. I mean, because I was, maybe around 7th grade, 6th, 7th grade or so when I got those.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just fun. It was different. It caught my imagination. So, like I said, it was just enjoyable, and a lot, like I said, a lot of it did go over my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I did get a bunch of the back issues, and going back and rereading them as an adult, a lot of the stuff makes a lot more sense to me, and I get what Steve Gerber was doing.
Mm-hmm.
But in a bizarre way, it's almost kind of like Bullwinkle, where you can read it as you could watch it as a kid and enjoy it, but you could also watch it as an adult and get all these jokes that were going over the kids' heads.
Mm.
So I think it kind of worked that way for me. There was enough in it that I really enjoyed, that even though I wasn't catching everything that Gerber was putting out there, it was still a lot of fun.
So I'm curious, like, how do you, and I'm always curious about this with old kids, because I see this with, like, my son now, like, seeing how one comic book can transform into many comic books, or, like, suddenly, is it the form, is it the media, is it the characters? And so I'm curious, like, how quickly did that kind of blow up for you in terms of your own kind of early fandom?
It caught on pretty quickly. I don't remember exactly what my next comic book was, but I started following Spider-Man a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He was my favorite superhero character for quite a number of years. Which, at the time he was in high school and, just a little bit older than me, but I could really relate to a lot of the stuff he went through in his normal life. And
mm-hmm.
then, of course, there was the fantasy aspect of it. Of, if I had powers like that, what would I do? So I got that, and there were so many other interesting comics then that caught my attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm probably going to be jumping around on years here, but Fantastic Four and Shogun Warriors and Micronauts. And boy, what else was it? Those are the ones that immediately spring to mind.
Mm-hmm.
They were just a lot of fun. I really got into them. One of my friends was a big George Perez fan, so he got me into Avengers. So there was a lot of stuff that I kind of gravitated towards fairly quickly, I think.
Mm-hmm. So when given where eventually, you're branding up, our end point obviously is back issue. So as we kind of build up, the picture of you, I'm curious, everyone has a different moment for this, but at what moment do you start kind of making that shift between just loving characters and, the different books you're reading, and started to really understand or realize, it's this particular artist, or it's this particular writer? Like, was it as early as your friend who's the fan of George Perez, or was it later on where you first started kind of being like, I'm going to pick up this book because it's this person?
It actually started really pretty quickly. I should throw in there, I just remembered, Doctor Strange was a huge favorite back in the day as well. It actually started for me pretty quickly. Because to this day, I'll always point to Gene Colan as being probably my favorite comic artist.
Mm.
And he drew that first issue of Howard that I ever read. So I would seek out stuff that he drew. I would seek out Steve Gerber's stuff. And a lot of that at that point was finding stuff as back issues.
Mm-hmm.
But his Man-Thing I thought was great as well. And I don't mean that in any double entendre sort of way, but that's just one of those character names. But I latched on to favorite writers and artists pretty quickly. And I also latched on to some of the tie-in things to TV shows and stuff like that. Like, I actually read all of the Marvel's Battlestar Galactica series.
Oh, wow.
Which got me to become a fan of Walt Simonson because Walter drew and actually wrote a number of those as well.
Speaking of, obviously, 70s and some of the books that were coming out, I mean, a connection for later is obviously Mike Ploog is big in that period, and you ended up later doing, the Modern Masters on him. What was your first kind of introduction to Ploog back in the day?
Oh, boy. It was one of two things, and I don't recall which came first. It was either... I think it was Marvel Premiere. He did a Weird World story in that. So it was either the Weird World story he drew or one of his Man-Thing stories. I'm guessing probably for Giant Size #1. So it was probably one of those two. But I'm not really certain where I first saw his stuff.
So I'm going to jump ahead myself, so in kind of violating my own chronology here. But like, how did you come to be one of the people who put together the Modern Masters on Mike Ploog to begin with?
Well, the first Modern Masters I did was on Walter Simonson, and I dove into that one being, probably breaking all sorts of rules that I was supposed to. Because I thought that was, I had done a bunch of interviews for Westfield Comics by that time. And I really liked Walter's stuff. And he and Wheezy were at a show in Chicago that I went to. And I threw that idea out at him about doing that. And he said he would be up for it. And so then I went home and reached out to Tomorrow's and said, hey, Walter said he'd do this if you're interested in having me do this. And
did you have any connection with Tomorrow's at this point in time?
Nope.
Amazing.
Nope. I just kind of went barreling in head first, and I contacted Eric, who was the guy who came up with the Modern Masters concepts, and said, hey, he said he'd do this. Are you interested in having me interview him for this? And he said yes, so I ended up doing that one. And then once that was done and they were happy with that, at some point, Eric said to me, hey, would you be interested in doing one on Mike Ploog? And I said, sure. So that was just an idea that was given to me, and I said, yeah, I like his stuff enough, let's go for it.
I'm curious, I mean, obviously, as someone, you've interviewed a lot of people over the years, but when you're doing something like the Modern Masters, which is a very intensive project and an intensive kind of interview process, is it hard to come out of that afterwards? And I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this, and I don't mean this in a negative in any way, but I found sometimes in prepping for interviews with, comic creators, etc., that after having that interview, if I had a negative opinion on that person's work before, I feel the negative opinion starts to go away. It's almost like I can't see it anymore because I'm like, now I just see the person and I see the effort. And I'm curious how you felt about, I mean, obviously we're not talking about the same thing because we're not talking about someone who necessarily had negative work, but I'm curious how you come out of that process and how your feeling about the work maybe has changed or evolved after you've spent so much time with someone and talked to someone at such length about their work?
It's an interesting question. I think with both Walter and Mike, it became more. I gained a greater appreciation for their work and what they do, and something that really hit me that I remember Walter saying at one point, because we were talking about his adaptation of Stephen King's Lawnmower Man, and he drew like every single blade of grass in that story. It was very, very intense work. And I asked him about that once, and his response was basically, well, it was the job. Because I think there's a lot of people, and I know I certainly thought this way, that, hey, comics are a lot of fun. These guys must, have a great time doing it. And I'm not saying they don't, but at the end of the day, it's their job. It's what they have to do, and they may love it, but there's some of those that are a lot of work. And so I think doing those longer interviews really made me appreciate the work that went into these comics that I enjoyed.
So it really matured your interpretation of the work, I guess. Yeah,
definitely.
So I'm going to ask you a question that I can only really ask someone who's done other interviews with people. So I've done a lot of comic creator interviews for the podcast, and it's interesting that even though I've done so many, I always had this pit in my stomach right before I'm about to hit record or before I'm about to call. I'm curious if you ever felt that, like you're about to talk to someone. Doesn't matter how many interviews you've done. Do you sometimes have that kind of that pit in your stomach just for a moment? The minute you start talking, it goes away. But do you still have that?
Oh, all the time.
So I'm not alone.
All the time, and there's, as much as the little kid in me wouldn't believe this, there are certain creators that I've gotten to know well, and if I'm interviewing them for something, I can, just go in and, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? All this, there's a very personal relationship there, but it's still an interview, and I get nervous. I read somewhere, I don't remember who this was, but somebody who did interviews, not necessarily comic interviews or interviews with comic creators or things that way, but just interviews in general, that he said the only time he really worried about an interview was if he wasn't nervous beforehand. Because then he knew that, something's up here, this may not go well. But yeah, I've always been that way, and it's something I'm used to because, I played in band when I was growing up. I was in theater in high school and college. And I could have all sorts of nervous energy going into it, but as soon as I said my first line or as soon as I played my first note, that was all over. It was the anticipation was way worse than getting there. Once I started, it was fun, and it's that way with interviewing comic creators as well, I think.
So I guess as for people who are listening to this who may not know much about kind of obviously you're taking over Back Issue. Like, what can you tell us about who is Roger? Like, where did Roger come from?
Well, Roger came from, like I said, I grew up reading comics, and my big goal when I graduated high school was to become a writer and eventually write comic books. And so I studied creative writing in college, and then when I graduated, I hadn't found a job or anything yet, so I started working for Westfield Comics, which is a fairly well-known, I believe, mail order company, and we do have a local store as well. but I started doing all sorts of stuff there, and eventually started working on our newsletter. And even though I didn't, even though I wasn't using creative writing stuff, I was learning editing, and I was still doing writing and stuff that way. And at some point, we started doing some interviews. I remember the first one, which I didn't do. It was I was assistant editor on the catalog at the time, and my editor did the interview. But Topps Comics had reached out to us because they were just doing the adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And so my editor at the time, Joyce Greenholt, interviewed both Roy Thomas and Mike Mignola about that. And then we started having some other stuff come our way, and for whatever reason, she started throwing the interviews at me instead of doing them herself, which I was completely fine with. It got me to talk to a lot of creators whose work I liked. But my very first interview, which still kind of amuses me, was with Todd McFarlane for the Image Batman Spawn crossover.
Oh, really? Wow.
So, yeah, so I kind of jumped into the deep end, with my first interview being with someone who was very, very big at the time, and I was very nervous about that. But once we started doing those, we could, reach out to various publishers or whatever and try to get interviews with different people. And it just kind of steamrolled from that. And so I've done more interviews than I can remember at this point. And they've all been fun.
What was
some of them more than others, but some are.
I remember I saw a post online once where someone was talking about favorite comic book podcasts, and someone was very nice and mentioned mine. And he's like, "Oh, Adam has a great rapport with all his guests. There's only ever been one interview that was tough to listen to." And I was like, "Oh man." And I listened, but I looked at the comments some more, and he was basically saying like, as long as that person's not named Peter David, the interview's great. And I'm like, oh, because I had one interview with Peter David, and I could tell Peter David didn't really want to do the interview, and but he did it. He did it. He gave me the half hour, but it was definitely one of the tougher ones. He was not as giving with just insights or whatever, but he's still very nice to me, and I've never thought anything of it. But apparently, this listener was like, "Oh, that was the rough one."
No, I interviewed him a time or two and never had anything that way with him that I remember.
It's almost like the listener picked up on something I didn't, because I was I thought it was fine, but it definitely felt like I had to work for it a bit more. But I'm like, whatever, that's just his style. But I guess I guess maybe the listener didn't feel that way.
But yeah, so I did a lot of stuff that way, and then as Westfield evolved, and we went onto the web, and we had a blog, and I continued interviewing people for that. But we also had different people write for us, and so I got to edit their work and contact them and talk to them about stuff. So regulars were Casey Carlson, who was an editor at DC for quite a while. He did Legion and Superman. He was the editor for Zero Hour. But he had worked at Westfield a number of years before. So, someone that I knew. And Bo Smith, who's always been a good friend to Westfield, he wrote a lot for me. Wayne Markley wrote some columns. He used to work for Capitol, and then went into business with a couple other guys as FMI until the whole sort of distribution falling apart. and Bob Greenberger wrote a bunch of stuff for us as well.
Oh, really?
So I got to know them and got to work with them on their stuff. So that was that. And at some point during during all of that, DC for a number of years had a thing called the Retailer Representative Program.
Yeah.
And which was basically there were a certain number of comic shops around the country that they got more information from than others, and as a response gave us a bit more. I think that's how it worked. But every year they would have a weekend-long retreat where they basically told us all about what's coming up in the next year and everything. And I always got sent to those for Westfield, and one of the years there I met Mark Nathan, who owns a shop called Comics, Cards, and Collectibles out in Maryland in the Baltimore area.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also the guy who's in charge of the Baltimore Comic-Con. And we hit it off really well, and I started going to Baltimore. I live in Wisconsin, so it was a bit of a trip, but I'd go to Baltimore for the shows because they were fun, and I had some friends in the area and stuff. And when the person who was doing programming for him quit for whatever reason, he asked if I'd be interested in doing it. So I said, okay. So for quite a number of years, I did programming for Baltimore and got to know quite a few other people in the comics industry because of that. And also at some point in there, I started writing for Back Issue.
So how did that connection come about with? I mean, obviously you already had the Tomorrow's connection at this point, right?
Yeah.
So,
if I remember right, I really wanted to do a story on Marshall Rogers because I always liked his stuff, and I thought that would be fun. And I threw that out as a Modern Masters idea, and for a reason I don't recall, was told no, but said, hey, why don't you contact Michael Eury, see if he'd be interested in something that way for Back Issue. And he wasn't at that particular point, but he put me on the list of writers, and I pitched for a story and got it and was going to start writing it, and then that story got canceled because of issues. I don't know exactly what went on. But the theme of that issue, of Back Issue, was I think sort of media-related things and stuff that way. And so I said, hey, what about a story on the first run of Gladstone Comics? Because I've always liked the Disney stuff, and that sort of reintroduced Disney comics and got a lot of great Carl Barks stuff, but that's also when Don Rosa started, and you had guys like William Van Horn and stuff like that coming in as well. So it was a really interesting, I thought, time for Disney Comics, and Michael said, sure, go for it, and I wrote that, and he liked it enough, and I just kept pitching for stuff when something came along that interested me, and that was pretty much how that came about. Nothing too tricky there.
So I'm curious about the general process of writing for Back Issue, though, because, I mean, obviously there's a lot of research that goes into most of these articles in terms of how in-depth they are. So I'm curious, like, obviously, and I would imagine this will be a question I ask you later, but obviously with Michael, worked so far in advance in terms of what he was plotting out, in terms of, like, we already have artwork for, covers that are coming out some, like, middle of next year. Like, he was really far ahead for the magazine game. So I'm curious, when you're working in that as a writer, generally speaking, how long did you have between kind of pitch and then having the final product, and how intensive was the research process during that interim?
I think when I was going through training with Michael, he told me that it was usually roughly 6 months to turn it, from when we were assigned the article to when we had to send it in.
Mm-hmm.
And then it'd be a few months after that it would be published. So, roughly 6 months. It depends on, I guess, depending on the person, how much research they put into it. I know what I usually do or have done is I will go back and reread whatever I'm writing about, take notes, and then if there are interviews involved with it, try to choose, and this is something I did at Westfield too, my sort of guiding rule was, okay, what our readers want to know, and what are things I want to know that maybe the reader might not think about,
Mm-hmm.
but then also pay attention to their answers, because they might give me little hints in their answers that are like, oh, hey, there's more to this story here. Mm-hmm. So, I want to ask more about that. And so once I get all the interviews done, then I start thinking about the story. I'm a little bit backwards that way, in that I will think about a story a lot before I write it.
Mm-hmm.
So the writing part is actually fairly quick once I get to it. But there's still a lot of process along the way, and I usually kind of find if I'm doing more than one interview for an article, there'll be an interview that something will happen during it that will make me go, oh, this is how I want the story to go. They just gave me a good idea for how to make this story work.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm doing a pro to pro or just interviewing one person, well, then I still figure that out. But yeah, I usually at some point will hit on a idea of, oh, okay, this is how I want the focus to go. This is how I want it to work,
Mm-hmm.
and go from there.
So I'm curious, I mean, obviously, I guess when we're speaking, you've officially taken over for Michael. You took over September 1st, I believe, right?
Yep.
So I'm curious, obviously there was, a handoff process, and it wasn't just like suddenly you're in charge. So I'm curious, how far in advance did this process start, with you starting to kind of work with him? Because obviously a lot of these books are now going to be coming out under your purview, but they were technically started during his kind of tenure. So I'm curious what that collaboration was like.
It technically started, what's that? Hold on, gotta do some mathing in my head. Beginning of May would have been my official start time. So, 4 months officially. The whole interview process and stuff started very late last year.
Mm.
And I was offered the job, I think, in January, if I remember right. So even though Michael was careful, because he's like, okay, you're not technically on the payroll yet, but I want to throw some ideas at you and stuff. And so I'd occasionally get asked, can you think of a story idea for this theme that's different than one I have, or something like that. So there was a little bit of contact
Mm-hmm.
and interaction between us before May. but once it started, I mean, it was great. Michael was very easy to work with, very encouraging. It was, I think it went as well as a process like that could go, honestly. You know, he encouraged me to ask questions if I had questions, and yeah, there were a number of things I did, both, you know, technical and just, okay, you know, how do you do this sort of thing? To even coming up with themes is sort of a a trick on its own, but it's one I really enjoy. So
I'm excited to see the themes we start getting. So I guess that's the question too. Is like, what's the first official issue that has your name on it under the masthead?
That would, I think, be 156.
Okay.
Which is that right? No, issue before that, 155 would be the first one, I believe, that will have my name on it, which is, I don't remember the technical or what the actual theme for the issue is. I always think of it as the haunted house issue because it's got like, you know, House of Mystery, House of Secrets, stuff like that in it. So that was the first one that I worked a lot on. Mm-hmm. And then 156 after that is the graphic novel issue, which I did a lot of the heavy lifting on because Michael really wanted to focus on 157, which was our Keith Giffen tribute issue.
Oh, of course.
And so that's actually the last one that he is working on as editor. Now, granted, 158 through, I think, 161 are all ones that were started by him. Mm-hmm. So, you know, his fingerprints are all over those as well.
So how surreal is it to, you know, take over a magazine that was, you know, edited by him for like over 150 issues for 20-something years? Like, that's not a small task for sure. So is it both exciting? Is it kind of like, as we were talking about, like what it is when you first interview someone, like you have the butterflies, but also you know what you're doing, or like how does it feel?
It's both. I mean, I'm very excited about it. I think there's you know, I enjoy the magazine a lot. I think there's a lot of fun stuff to do. I've had a lot of fun coming up with themes and stories for upcoming issues that, you know, that part's really enjoyable for me. The writing crew that we have is wonderful, and they've all treated me well, and it's been a very welcoming atmosphere. So I'm very excited going forward. But as you said, there's also those nerves there because this is, you know, I got big shoes to fill. Mm-hmm. You know, people know Michael and they know his work, and I just want to try to keep the book at the level that it has been, so people can go, oh, hey, this Roger guy's going to do okay.
That's what we all hope for, right?
Yeah, and like I said, and for my first handful of issues, Michael has consulted with me on story ideas and been very supportive on stuff that way. And yeah, I think we've got some really fun stuff coming up.
One thing I always appreciated about his eye for detail, and I'm hoping that we can, you know, continue to see this as well, is even just, you know, some of the ways that some of the covers would have, you know, different text on the back issue font, right? Like different styles. Like issue 150 had that, you know, that kind of giant size spectacular kind of look to it. Like I just always liked how, and even I guess issue 159, the Crisis issue, has kind of an adaptation of the back issue font to kind of match Crisis. So I always love seeing those little touches. So I'm hoping we still get to see them.
As far as I know, we will, because those are all the purview of the guy who designs the covers for us, whose name is escaping me at the moment. So I'm going to go over here where I know I have an issue, a back issue. I can tell you his name. But that's all done.
Oh, it's Cronenberg, right?
By Michael Cronenberg. Yeah, I mean
right.
that sort of stuff is his.
Okay.
And he does a nice job with that. You know, he does an excellent job. The first story the first issue that I think of as mine, the cover's all completed for that, and he did, you know, a great job on the layout for that. And there's lots of neat little touches and things in there that I really enjoy.
So I have to ask, obviously Michael had a very specific kind of remit for what the boundaries of things that would be covered by back issue would, you know, be. Is that obviously still a pretty hard and fast rule to keep with the spirit that he, you know, engaged the magazine in, or is that something that might be, you know, a little bit more flexible or loose under your own purview? Or like, how do you view back issue?
I still view back issue as focusing on the Bronze Age. But I also personally don't have problems moving forward some, because we have done, I mean, even under Michael, we did stuff that, you know, moved out of that period. I mean, there was a story on Hellboy, which, you know, late 80s maybe, or into the 90s. I wrote a story, back 4 years ago, about Mage, and looked at all three of the Mage series, the most recent one of which came out in the 2000s. So with that one, though, it started in the 80s, so there was that nice connection.
You are right, though. There were some books, obviously, that did skirt the line. Like, I remember, I'm embarrassed to say that this was one of my first issues, because I never saw it here at my comic shop. I think I only really started with, like, 111. I obviously filled up that back catalog, but 111 was, like, an Earth X focus. I'm like, that's not typically within what you would expect to see in back issue at all.
But on the other hand, what it says on, you know, the table of contents page is, and I want to get this right, you know, comics Bronze Age and beyond. So going some beyond is not, you know, out of the purview of the magazine, even though, like I said, I think the desire, you know, both for John Morrow and myself, is to keep it as much as possible in the Bronze Age. But if we skirt outside of it a little bit, I don't think people have been too annoyed when we've, you know, gone into the 90s a little bit.
I'm curious about, I mean, in general, with the magazine, like, how do you focus, or sorry, not how do you focus, but in terms of, you know, obviously respecting the Bronze Age, etc., but also, you, as you know, obviously the magazine's been around a while. It's had a lot of different focuses, and Michael had a really good memory for certain things that he captured in the magazine. So, you know, you'd be reading a feature article, and they'd be like, "Oh, check out this back issue for this." How extensively well put together is the kind of the catalog or a reference material, because obviously he worked on them all, so he had more of an innate knowledge for where to be able to pick up other places where specific stories might have been referenced. So how is that daunting for you to try and make sure that this is still respected and something you are able to refer back to without having worked on those books and maybe not remembering them all?
Yeah, that is something that we talked about, and yeah, if something jumps out at me where I can say, hey, for this complete story, or for a story about this, check out back issue 25 or whatever it was. It's cool. I don't recall the guy's name off the top of my head, but there is a guy on the Back Issue Facebook page who's actually put together an index, the most recent one going up to issue 150, for subjects and everything that's been covered in there.
Oh, wow.
So I look at that a lot, because especially, I can come up with a theme and go, oh, hey, it'd be great to have a story about this in it, and then I look and say, oh, no, that was covered back in issue 51, so I can't do that story. But yeah, that is a great reference for me on things like that. And I do remember talking with Michael specifically at one point about him saying, if you catch something like that, make a reference. And Gus and John, who do are like the main admins on the Facebook page, they're both very good at that too. So even you can see someone, on a thread, well, someone will bring up something and John will pop in with, oh, hey, we covered some of that stuff back in issue 22 or whatever, and, provide a link back to that. So, they can check that out or whatever. So I have a lot of support, I think, on that.
That's really good. A bigger picture question. I'm just curious because obviously, as you said, like when you were writing the Modern Masters books, and you did kind of pitch John Morrow on the project, and now you're working on back issue that's under directly under John as well. Like, what is your relationship with John like at this point?
It's good. He's a nice guy. I like working with him. If I have questions, I reach out to him. I always run themes past him, and, he can say, yeah, I like that one, or why don't you work on this one and try to, work it into this direction or that direction, and that's all worked very well. I haven't had a ton of contact with him at this point, but what I have had has been very good, and he's very supportive, and it's great. That's one of the things I've been very thankful about, is both him and Michael were very supportive about me taking on the job, and have really helped me out, and I really appreciate that they both did that so well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So obviously you mentioned I guess what number did you say? You said 155 is probably the one that starts to have the most fingerprints of yours so far. What is there any particular themes that you're really excited about in the next 5 or 6 issues? Because obviously if people go to the the Tomorrow's website, they can kind of see the blurbs about some of these upcoming issues and some of the cover artwork that's been articulated. But is there anything in particular in those issues that you're really excited about?
Well, I've been doing some work on issue 158, which is Hey Mister, which is all characters with Mr. in their name. So like Mr. Fantastic, and Mr. Monster, and Mr. Weatherby, and all sorts of people like that. And that one has been great. I've read all the articles for it. I think they're all a lot of fun. Very interesting stuff, and even with characters that I know a lot about, such as Mr. Fantastic, there was still stuff that I learned, and that one I think is going to be a really good issue.
Fantastic cover.
What was that?
I said it looks like a fantastic cover.
Oh yeah, that one's a good cover. Another that I'm really looking forward to, because it has a lot of my story ideas in it, is 161, I believe, which is the Mutant Mayhem issue. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do a lot of Marvel Mutant stuff in that one, and which growing up X-Men was like the title to read.
Absolutely.
So, so got a lot of stories in there that, mean a lot to me because, hey, this is when I was reading the book. These are exciting things to get to read about and see what the writers do with it.
I guess I should ask because I didn't really, but I mean, so you grew up a fan of comics. Obviously, you followed comics for a long time. You stayed abreast of comics. Are you still reading modern comics?
Some, not near as many as I used to. I think the vast majority of stuff that's coming out for Marvel and DC isn't written for me anymore, and that's okay. I'm not saying that in a bad way. It's just a lot of them don't grab me. I have been reading a lot of the DC stuff that Mark Waid's been writing and really enjoying that, like Brave and the Bold and Shazam. I'm looking forward to the Batman series he's going to do with Chris Samney.
Oh yeah.
So I think those would be great because I heard really good things about it and I liked the character. I went back and started reading Jed McKay's run on Doctor Strange, which is really very good. I'm really enjoying it so far.
Yeah.
So I don't tend to read a lot of stuff that way anymore, but there's some, and yeah, there's still other things out there that I really enjoy. A book that I highly recommend people checking out is Impossible Jones.
Okay.
It started as a Kickstarter book. I believe someone is actually publishing it, for comic shops and stuff as well. But it's written by Carl Kiesel, who's, written a lot of great stuff and is a fabulous inker and such. And it's drawn by David Hahn. And it's just a lot of fun. It's a modern comic, but it has the spirit of the stuff I grew up with.
Yep.
Where I believe, if I remember right, in the first graphic novel for it, Carl sort of described it as his take on Plastic Man, where a villain gets these stretching powers, but in Plastic Man's case, he then became a good guy, where in Impossible Jones, who is a female, she is only pretending to be a hero and is still doing stuff kind of behind the backs of some of the heroes. And it's just a lot of fun. It really is. I highly recommend people checking that out. That's a book I enjoy a lot. And I enjoy stuff that is not necessarily written for people my age. I know both John Gallagher and Jamar Nicholas, and both the Leon books and the Max Meow books, which are done for younger readers, are just a lot of fun. And you can probably find those in most bookstores.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I find that over the years, my desire to have comics be fun has really gone up, and so there's something about I'll read a book and I'm like, I just want some whimsy. And I feel like it's probably a reaction to over the last 20 years. Marvel and DC got excessively dark at times, and we're trying to try and tell very serious stories. And I'm like, sometimes I just want some fun. And it's interesting you bring up Mark Waid's current DC stuff, because I feel like the collaborators he's worked with, for the most part, have really brought that sense of fun. Like him doing Shazam or World's Finest. Like you have him and Dan Mora, and Dan Mora's just having a fun time and making big, colorful, fun superhero stuff. And it has stakes to it. It's not like it's, all lollipops and rainbows, but it also has a sense of whimsy and fun to it as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Shazam has... talking dinosaurs from outer space. What's not to like about that?
And they're accountants too, right?
At least some of them are, yes.
Yeah. So no, there's a real good sense of fun about it.
There is that, but there's the gods are messing with him. Mm-hmm. So it as you said, it's not all sunshine and roses. But I enjoy the books that still have that sense of fun. Mm-hmm. And I also discovered within the past year that Kyle Baker's self-publishing a lot of his stuff.
Really?
Now, I think anything now, and it's a lot of fun. If you can find it, just go to his website and get them there. It's a lot. They're really good. The most recent one was basically a giant monster story. So
that's very fun. Well, again, Roger, thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm very excited to see your vision of back issue come out and start to permeate the pages as sadly Michael's stuff will become less and less, and it'll be more your project in full. And I've really, as I said, I was a late comer to back issue, but I've been such a fan of it because I'm actually embarrassed it took me that long to find it, because it's completely scratches the itch I have for loving comic book history and wanting to learn more about all these books. So I'm very excited to see what you have coming up for us in the next few months.
Oh, thank you very much.
And hopefully it's a very long tenure.
Oh, thank you. I hope so, too, because I am really having a lot of fun with this, and I hope that translates through to the readers.
Although it does make me very curious to have you back in like a year and be like, okay, how is it coming up with these themes now? Like it's easy the first few times, right? Mm-hmm. So very curious to see what that's like. But again, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, no problem at all.
All right. Thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you.